Thank you. Thank you all for coming. My name is Frank Bremer. I've been studying, writing about, teaching about Puritans in the Atlantic world for nigh on to 50 years now. And I hope that I will still be doing that in another 11 years when we can all gather together again for the 400th anniversary of the settlement of Boston. Let me get right into this. Next year will be marked by numerous events commemorating the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the Mayflower and the settlement of New England's first permanent English colony. Tourists are expected to flock to board the Mayflower II in Plymouth Harbor and to drive out to visit the living history museum called Plymouth Plantation. As those events wind to an end, we will start anticipating the 400th anniversary of the settlement of the communities that have become, or that became, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And we'll also celebrate those in the other New England that Tad Baker was talking about earlier today. Such anniversaries offer an opportunity to reassess what we know about the events being commemorated. But in the case of New England's early history, such hopes have proved illusory. In 1931, Samuel Eliot Morison, following the Tercentenary celebrations of the founding of Massachusetts, wrote a short essay entitled, "Those Misunderstood Puritans." During the then just concluded Tercentenary, the State Commission recorded 2,083 events held in 253 communities in the Commonwealth, attracting over 11 million people. Those events included 1,150 school exercises, 165 religious services, 103 pageants, 58 parades, 82 music events, 300 congresses and conventions, 101 historical meetings, and 29 monument dedications. 275 historical markers were placed around the Commonwealth. Special radio programs told the stories of early Massachusetts. But at the end of it all, Morison lamented that the average man was not convinced. The average man, he wrote, regards the fathers of New England as a set of somber killjoys whose greatest pleasure was preventing simple folk from enjoying themselves, and whose principal object in life was to repress beauty and inhibit human nature. 100 years later, despite the best efforts of numerous scholars in various disciplines, the depiction of the Puritan fathers, in Morison's words again, as joyless, dark-minded, petty entrepreneurs who believed in human depravity, erected a theocratic state, and tyrannized their subjects within an inch of their lives, remains firmly entrenched. Even organizations dedicated to understanding the earliest years of this city fall prey to the stereotypes and focus more on the vices of the settlers than their virtues. And thus far, neither municipal nor state government have shown an interest in educational programs such as occurred 100 years ago. The loose partnership of over 40 institutions and 50 individual scholars that makes up New England Beginnings, which I'm pleased to be coordinator of, was organized to encourage all of its member institutions to propose, plan, and promote events that will commemorate the cultures, English, Native, Black, that shaped early New England 400 years ago. In doing so, we need to be alert to both the vices and the virtues and attempt to cut through the prevailing stereotypes that I've already mentioned to understand the men and women of the 17th century in the context of their times. The story of the Native and Black roles in the shaping of New England is very important. But today, I want to address one part of the story, to look at who the English settlers were, what they believed, and how they conducted themselves in everyday life. The roots of Puritanism date back to the beginnings of the English Reformation that began with Henry VIII's rejection of papal authority in the 1530s. Because Henry's actions were based not, as were those of Luther or Calvin, on doctrinal differences with Rome, but jurisdictional imperatives, the newly erected Church of England was like a house without furnishings. From its earliest days, its leaders and members debated how it should be governed and what its doctrinal foundation should be. Some were content to retain much of what had been defined as Roman Catholicism, while others, led by those who came to be known as Puritans, wished to purge the English Church of the remnants of that faith. Those who looked to Luther and Calvin for inspiration accomplished many, but not all of the reforms they hoped for during the brief reign of Edward VI. But Edward died young, and those gains were reversed when his half-sister, the Catholic Mary Tudor, succeeded him. Her effort to restore Catholicism created martyrs to the faith, with the execution of over 300 English men and women who would not abandon their beliefs, while she chased other Englishmen into exile on the continent, where they saw at firsthand reforms that they had aspired to being implemented. Elizabeth I, succeeding her half-sister Mary, after Mary died 5 years into her reign, made England a Protestant nation once again, but was never able to fully quell the debate over the nature of that church. The resulting religious landscape was far more complex than often portrayed. Most, perhaps the vast majority of Englishmen, were content to accept the forms and practices prescribed by the Queen and her bishops for their worship. But on either end of the religious spectrum, there were a growing number of clerics and lay people who believed that further changes in the national church were necessary. On one extreme were individuals who challenged what was the church's broad commitment to Calvinist theology. At Cambridge in 1595, William Barrett, chaplain at Caius College, criticized the teaching of unconditional predestinarian beliefs. Another Cambridge professor questioned the doctrine of limited atonement, the Calvinist teaching that Christ's sacrifice atoned only for the sins of those already saved. Questioning such beliefs continued into the next century, with much of the focus centering on the teachings of the Dutch theologian Jacob Arminius. But while these churchmen revisited Calvinist theology, others, also on what we might identify as the conservative end of the spectrum, lamented the stripping of the altars and the loss of the ceremonial grandeur of Roman Catholicism. They sought to restore the beauty of holiness by emphasizing the importance of clerical vestments, restoring altars to their elevated positions in church buildings, requiring that parishioners kneel to receive the Lord's Supper, and advocating similar steps that many saw as a retreat to former Catholic practice. Historians have found it difficult to define those on this end of the religious spectrum. Many scholars settling for Laudianism in discussing the 17th century manifestation of these beliefs, because it seemed that most of them were supported by Archbishop William Laud. But the fact is that not all who advocated ceremonial renewal agreed on which ceremonies were to be restored, and not all who sought such changes questioned Calvinist doctrine. And not all who did seek revisions of predestinarian belief, called Arminians by their enemies, were interested in the beauty of holiness. While there were those who sought both types of change, the unity of this presumed faction was more in the eyes of its opponents than as a matter of fact. The identification of those on the other end of the spectrum as Puritans is likewise misleading. While most of these clergy and lay people believed that the reform of the church had not gone far enough, they were far from an organized faction with a single plan of action. Starting in the 1570s, some of them sought a Presbyterian restructuring of the church's organization through parliamentary action. When the Queen put an end to that, clergy in various regions of England organized themselves into an unofficial Presbyterian or classis movement with regional conferences of clergy that met to discuss religious matters. But this effort was detected and suppressed by the authorities in the 1580s. This reform end of the religious spectrum also included more than the Presbyterian element. Some believed that individual congregations of believers should be free of any superior authority, whether Episcopal or Presbyterian. Others, identified as Puritans, were less concerned with such structural issues and more concerned with matters that presented themselves in local churches every Sabbath, such as what the minister was wearing, how well he could preach, and what ceremonies he employed in administering the sacraments. Lay believers, as well as clergy, met informally to discuss such issues. And again, it is worth emphasizing that as they sought to better discern the divine will, they did not all agree on a single platform of reform. And many of those who advocated ceremonial reform were neither Presbyterians nor Congregationalists. Following the death of Elizabeth and the accession of the Stuart monarchs to the English throne, James I in 1603, Charles I in 1625, some Englishmen became so discouraged about the consistent failure to further purify the national church that they decided to take matters into their own hands by forming their own separate congregations in which they could choose their own clergymen and worship as they pleased. This was illegal, as all Englishmen were required by law to attend the services in their parish church. There are quite a few and a variety of these so-called separatist congregations. The most famous, from our perspective, was formed early in the 17th century in Nottinghamshire, in the region surrounding the small town of Scrooby. William Brewster, who had served Queen Elizabeth's Secretary of State, William Davison, on various embassies to the Netherlands in the 1580s, had lost his position at court when Davison was cast out of office as a scapegoat for the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. Brewster retired to Scrooby, assuming the position his father had held as royal postmaster, and began to further his own interest in religious matters. Brewster, who had studied for a time at Cambridge, was drawn to a fervent Protestant position, and he soon was hosting gatherings of like-minded men and women in the manor house at Scrooby, repeating and commenting on sermons and discussing matters of faith and practice. After this group formed themselves into a church by drawing up and attesting to a covenant, they chose as their minister John Robinson and Richard Clifton. Because the congregants' activities violated the law, the group was subject to increasing challenges. In 1607, they decided to emigrate to the Netherlands, a country noted for its greater religious freedom and a place where other separatists had found refuge. The congregation ended up in Leiden. There they worshiped as they pleased for close to a decade, when a large part of the congregation decided to emigrate again. There were a variety of reasons, including the difficulty many had in living in a more manufacturing setting than they had been used to, the threat posed by the impending renewal of war between the Dutch and Spain, and the fears that their children were being drawn to the looser standards of Dutch culture. But not all could afford to leave in 1620. Pastor John Robinson remained with the majority, hoping to follow the initial migration, while Brewster led the group that we have learned to call the Pilgrims. Journeying to America on the Mayflower, they established themselves on Cape Cod in the final months of 1620. For most of the following decade, they were without a minister, their religious services conducted by their lay elder, William Brewster, with other laymen, such as Samuel Fuller and Robert Cushman, occasionally preaching as well. In keeping with what I previously said about the broad range of positions along the Puritan spectrum, it should be pointed out that Robinson, Brewster, and the other leaders of this congregation did not, like most separatists, reject all contact with those Puritans who remained in Church of England congregations. Brewster and others listened to sermons in Church of England churches when they occasionally returned home for business. Residents of Leiden who were not members of the congregation were free to listen to sermons preached by Robinson and others. Indeed, at least a few of those who journeyed on the Mayflower had joined the congregation as a result of such visits. In a forthcoming book, I will argue that the Plymouth congregation, Pilgrims if you will, was actually Puritan in every meaningful sense of the word, but holding a certain spot along the broad Puritan spectrum. My point here is to emphasize that efforts to offer a simple definition of what Puritanism was are doomed to failure. While there was a movement that can be labeled Puritan, the term encompassed a variety of temperaments. Particularly relevant for New England and important for us to understand is that there were some individual Puritans who came to believe that they had discovered the truth. They refused to entertain suggestions that they might be in error, and they sought to impose their views as a required orthodoxy. But the position of many others reflected an openness to receiving further light. This is best captured in Edward Winslow's recollection of the teachings of the Pilgrim's guide, John Robinson. Robinson, Winslow wrote, was very confident, the Lord hath more truth and light yet to break forth out of his holy word. Robinson exhorted his own congregation to take heed what we received for truth, and well to examine and compare and weigh it with other scriptures of truth. For, he said, it is not possible the Christian world should come so lately out of such thick anti-Christian darkness, and that full perfection of knowledge should break forth at once. Many of those who ended up in New England, both in Plymouth and in the colonies founded later, were open to this idea that further light might lead them to a closer understanding of God's will. They were well aware that they were, as St. Paul had put it, looking through a glass darkly. Though he did not migrate himself, John Robinson's career demonstrated a constant evolution of his own understanding of contested matters, and he advised Brewster and those who came to New England that the Lord hath more truth and light yet to break forth out of his holy word. A similar message is to be found in John Winthrop's famous Christian charity lay sermon, in which he told the Puritans journeying to Massachusetts, not only that they might be as a city upon a hill, but that if they faithfully sought God, they might, to quote Winthrop, see much more of his wisdom, power, goodness, and truth than formerly we have been acquainted with. Some of that openness was reflected in the way the early Bay colonists interacted with the Pilgrims. According to Samuel Fuller, church deacon and physician of the Plymouth Church, the Boston Lincolnshire clergyman, John Cotton, had charged those who sailed with Winthrop in 1630 to take advice of them of Plymouth and do nothing to offend them. And they did seek advice from the Plymouth colonists, and Plymouth exerted an important influence on the shaping of Massachusetts institutions. Fuller's contact with the Salem settlers in 1629 led those colonists to form their own congregational church along the Plymouth model before any clergyman had arrived. John Endicott, the governor of the early Salem settlement, wrote to Plymouth's Governor William Bradford that through his discussions with Samuel Fuller, he had found that he and the Plymouth faithful, meaning Bradford and the Plymouth faithful, and Endicott, were servants of one master and of the same household. God's people, he explained, are all marked with one and the same mark, and sealed with one and the same seal, and have for the main one and the same heart, guided by one and the same spirit of truth. And where this is, there can be no discord. Nay, there must be sweet harmony. Speaking of the Plymouth system, Endicott wrote that he was convinced that as far as I can yet gather, no other is warranted by the evidence of truth. Over the next few years, Fuller also discussed such matters with settlers in Charleston, Watertown, and Dorchester, and helped them to shape their churches. So indeed, it might be, as Plymouth's William Bradford later wrote, out of small beginnings, greater things have been produced. And as one small candle may light 1,000, so the light here kindled hath shone unto many. What characterized these churches in Plymouth and early Massachusetts was congregational forms and practices. A group of men and women who believed each other to be blessed by God's special grace entered into a covenant in which they promised and bound themselves, in the words of the Plymouth Covenant, to walk in our ways according to the rule of the gospel and in all sincere conformity to his holy ordinances and in mutual love and watchfulness over one another, depending wholly and only upon the Lord our God to enable us by his grace hereunto. Having formed their congregation, the members then chose the men to serve them as their religious elders, both pastor and teacher in most churches. All matters that came before the church were settled by the vote of the members. Furthermore, individual believers, women as well as men, were expected to read the scripture in their homes, encouraged to meet in what were in essence study groups to discuss its meaning, and allowed, through what was called prophesying, to ask questions of their clergy in public meetings and offer their own insights into what God wanted of them. Why is this story important? The centrality of Puritan congregationalism in New England culture had a number of significant implications which resonate throughout our history. Congregationalism in religious governance was a system with elements of participatory democracy, reflecting a trust in the individual believer. This then expanded into the civil realm, leading to the formation of town meetings and a colonial government led by annually chosen representatives of the people. Early New England was not, in any true sense, a theocracy. Secondly, the importance of lay empowerment in the formulation and shaping of congregationalism required that all individuals be capable of reading the scripture. The consequences of this included the passage of education laws, which required that all men and women, free and unfree, be taught to read, and the corresponding drive to make available the Bible and other religious literature for all, even leading to the translation of the scriptures into the native language so that the benefit of God's word would be accessible to native converts. The communal requirements of congregationalism, the mutual love to and watchfulness over one another, such as specified in the Pilgrims Church Covenant and copied by others, meant a concern to assist all members of the community. And I'd like to take some time to expand on this particular part of the Puritan New England legacy. This outlook, what can be called a social gospel, was perhaps most famously expressed by John Winthrop in his lay Christian charity sermon in 1630. Addressing those accompanying him to New England, he said, "We must be knit together in this work as one man. We must entertain each other in brotherly affection. We must be willing to abridge ourselves of our superfluities for the supply of others' necessities. We must delight in each other, make others' conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes our commission and community in the work, our community as members of the same body." But this was not unique. Similar sentiments had been and would be again uttered by other Puritans. 9 years before Winthrop preached his lay sermon, Plymouth's lay deacon Robert Cushman exhorted the colonists there to, quote, "labor to be joined together as one body and knit by flesh and sinew, away with envy at the good of others, and rejoice in his good and sorrow for his evil. Let his and others' joy be your joy, and his sorrow thy sorrow. Let his sickness be thy sickness, his hunger thy hunger, his poverty thy poverty. And if you profess friendship to others, be friends in adversity, for then a friend is known and tried, and not before." How does this fit with the expulsion of people from this community? Every society erects a perimeter fence that defines the line between acceptable belief and practice and what is unacceptable. The boundaries set in early New England were narrower than those that we set for our own society. And the result was that many individuals, including Anne Hutchinson, Baptists, Quakers, were excluded from the loving community Winthrop and Cushman spoke of. But while our understanding of what constitutes our community has changed, the message from the early period, the vision, if you will, is still relevant. To draw a comparison, in 1776, our nation's founders proclaimed that all men were created equal. But when they spoke of men, they did not include women, blacks, or various minorities. Over the years, that vision, though, has remained central to who we are as we expand the definition of what is included in the word men. Similarly, we can hold on to the vision of obligation to the community that Winthrop and Cushman spoke so eloquently about, while expanding our understanding of who is to be included in the community. The Puritan Pilgrim legacy contributes to the value we place on democratic processes, education, and a concern for our fellow man. But what of the legacy of so-called puritanical behavior? The harshness depicted in the Scarlet Letter, or the judgment of the American essayist H.L. Mencken when he defined Puritanism as the fear that someone somewhere may be happy. Perhaps nothing is more misunderstood about the Puritans than their moral outlook. And I wish to end this talk by speaking of this. A starting place is a statement by the 17th century English Puritan Richard Baxter. Overdoing is the most ordinary way of undoing. Puritans believed that all creation was God's gift and therefore intrinsically good. Sin came not by using what God had provided, but by abusing it. Puritans sought to understand where the line was between use and abuse and to stay on the proper side of that line. We can understand this best, perhaps, by focusing on some areas where misunderstandings are prevalent. One of these concerns alcohol. During America's experiment in prohibition a century ago, it was common to depict Puritans as the original critics of alcohol, and that depiction stuck. But in fact, Puritans drank various forms of beer and ale daily. It was an age when water was often impure and contaminated by human and animal waste. Long before pasteurization, milk too carried health risks. Drinks such as tea, coffee, and hot chocolate were just beginning to make their way into Europe, and the Coca-Cola bottling company was many centuries in advance to come. So most Englishmen, Puritans included, avoided sources of water and drank beers, ales, and if they were prosperous enough, wines. Even children who had been weaned from their mother's breast drank what was called small beer, a much less potent product. It was not drinking that the Puritans objected to, but excessive drinking. Drunkenness was the sin that they inveighed against and punished offenders for. To diminish the chances of this, Governor Winthrop forbade the offering of toast at his table, sensing that excessive offering of toast would lead to drunkenness. But he and his guests without toast still did consume beer with their meals, even breakfast. A second area of misunderstanding of ethical matters concerns how Puritans dressed. We have all seen the pictures of Puritan men and women dressed in drab, usually black garments. The reality is far different, and estate inventories reveal clothing of expensive fabrics and vibrant colors. It's not uncommon to find a gentleman who possessed a suit of yellow canary silk or cardinal red satin. The heart of Puritan views about dress was to wear what was appropriate to one's station in life. Laborers and farmers had limited wardrobes, often consisting of woolen outfits that were dyed in earth tones, colors less likely to reveal dirt and dust. At the other end of the social spectrum, the wealthier members of society might very well wear garments that you may have found worn by courtiers at the royal court. Sin would normally involve dressing above one's station in life, because it was both an attempt to deceive others about one's social worth, but also because it would leave less money available to spend for the care of one's family. A qualification to this should be made. While Puritans had no intrinsic objection to fine fabrics and gay colors, they did object to clothing that was deliberately fashioned to be sexually provocative, women's dresses with excessively low-cut bodices, and gentlemen's pants with exaggerated codpieces to highlight their genitals. And this issue of sexually provocative clothing leads us to the final example of the Puritans' views on the proper use of what God gave us. Reacting against the traditional Catholic tradition adopted by many early Protestant groups that viewed the purpose of sex as being procreation alone, and the performance of the act as something leading towards sin, if not intrinsically sinful, Puritans saw the gift of sex as a means of cementing and deepening love between a husband and wife. While procreation remained important, Puritans viewed marriage itself as the normal state for a Christian, and a union rooted in providing companionship to support one's spouse. The essence of this newer Puritan view of marriage can be found in the letters between John and Margaret Winthrop, and the poems Anne Bradstreet addressed to her husband Simon. Within this context, intercourse was seen as a joyous expression of love that should bind a couple together. Puritan pastors urged upon their congregations the duty to desire. The English Puritan minister William Gouge wrote that intercourse between a husband and wife should occur often, willingly, and cheerfully. In Massachusetts, the Boston Church on one occasion excommunicated a man for withholding sexual favors from his wife. But while intercourse between husband and wife was viewed as the proper use of sexuality that God bestowed upon man, any other use of that gift was an abuse. Thus, Puritans condemned and punished fornication, adultery, homosexuality, bestiality, and other sexual indulgences outside of marriage. And it's that story that Hawthorne wrote of in the Scarlet Letter. Throughout this talk, I presented the case for looking for the diversity that existed within the Puritan movement, doctrinally, organizationally, and ethically. The same diversity can be found in all areas of the culture. John Eliot sought to convert natives, but during King Philip's War, Captain Samuel Mosley committed atrocities against them. Many New England merchants were deeply engaged in the slave trade, yet Samuel Sewall wrote a tract against it. As we approach the 400th anniversary of the English settlement of New England, we need to avoid generalizations in seeking to appreciate the complexity of the cultures, plural, that shaped the region's history, and come to truly understand the Puritans and the other cultures that shaped New England. Thank you. I want to say two things about this. First, the top is the title of an app. I'm not sure if you've been moving. An app that Tad Baker and I developed a few years ago for the Congregational Library in New England Beginnings. It is a free app for iPhones and Android phones and tablets, and it has a lot of information on places in Boston that you can visit, descriptions of them, people, including pictures of them. It's well worth getting, and especially because it's free. And beyond that, that's my email address. If after this anyone wants to contact me for any reason, feel absolutely free. Questions? Or no questions? Mm-hmm. Yes?
Yeah, when John Wycliffe translated the Bible from Latin Vulgate into English, did that have the same impact, or any impact, like when everyone was required to read it, children were made to read, Native Americans made to read?
Wycliffe is the first one to really substantially translate the Bible into English, so it was welcomed. It was welcomed by lots of English Protestants, not just those who would be Puritans. It was not welcomed by Henry VIII, who actually worked to have Wycliffe captured and executed on the continent. But his translation becomes the basis for what was called the Bishop's Bible. It's also heavily used by those who did the Geneva Bible in the 1570s. The Geneva Bible became most popular among Puritans because it had extensive marginal commentary that would help people to understand the text and prompt discussions and so forth. Although even, the Wycliffe to the Bishops to the Geneva, there were many who had problems with the exactitude of the translation, which is why it was actually a Puritan request. Just about the only Puritan request that King James responded positively to, that a new translation be done. And so the authorized version, or King James version, does come out of that attempt to get a more accurate text. Yes. Yes?
Can you discuss any operational differences between the Puritan Mass Bay Colony and the Pilgrims Plymouth Colony?
There's not a lot. you know, the system of town meetings is very similar. The system of colony meetings with annual elections of a governor is very similar. Plymouth structurally suffers from being less prosperous from the very beginning, so they have a hard time getting clergy. They don't pass education laws such as Massachusetts does in the 1640s, although there's evidence that there is some education going on there. Plymouth will also be less intolerant, if you want. When you start getting concerned about Baptist Quakers in the mid-century, Plymouth does not react as negatively as the leaders in Massachusetts. The one other thing that I would say, one of the dynamics in Massachusetts, particularly in terms of religion, is that the clergy begin by the 1640s. There are clergymen who were pushing to establish, in essence, a clerical, I'm not going to say caste, but a clerical profession, and to emphasize the superior wisdom and so forth of the clergy. And so you begin to get things that cut back on the participation of the laity in an individual congregation. You begin to get the move in Massachusetts towards authoritative assemblies or synods, so that the lay spirit that is found more in Plymouth begins to diminish in Massachusetts. And again, that's in part because you don't have the same type of sort of elite ministry because they can't pay for that. But yes?
Is it significant that the Plymouth colony was initiated as a commercial enterprise, whereas Boston was more of a spiritual experiment?
Well, I mean, Massachusetts is settled by the Massachusetts Bay Company, which, you know, is initially considered to be a commercial enterprise because everyone recognized that for any type of society to survive, there had to be an economic viability to it. Now, one of the things that is different is that the Massachusetts Bay Company is organized by merchants and others who are committed to the Puritan cause, whereas a lot of the investors in Plymouth were not, and that in the critical decision to approve the movement of the charter to Massachusetts, the investors in the Massachusetts Bay Company do vote in favor of that. And so they, in a sense, give up their investment to a large degree. But, you know, definitely the disconnect between most of those who put up the money for the Mayflower voyage and subsequent voyages and the people who actually went is a troublesome matter. But, yes?
How do you see, in 1691, Massachusetts Bay Colony, Plymouth had yoke?
Yeah.
I've heard that was sort of a dramatic event, somewhat, with the people in Massachusetts. Is that sort of how you've seen it?
Yeah, two things. One, in many respects, by the 1680s, and I'd start there, Plymouth had been culturally and economically largely absorbed into Massachusetts. I mean, most of the clergy who were getting pulpits in Plymouth were Harvard graduates. Trade links between the two were strong. So now what happens is that in 1684, the king revokes the charter of Massachusetts and incorporates all of the colonies in New England into the Dominion of New England, under a royal governor general, Edmund Andros. So that's the first point at which the two colonies really are part of the same larger entity. After the Glorious Revolution in England overthrows James II and the Massachusetts Charter is restored in 1691, yeah, Plymouth is kept as part of the larger entity. I haven't looked very deeply into the Plymouth reactions to that, but I don't think there's any significant difference. And in fact, a number of, one of the other things that happens, and I think we're out of time, but finish this. One of the other things that happens is that during the course of the 17th century, a lot of people in Plymouth, most notably Edward Winslow, are identifying as well with Massachusetts. In fact, Winslow will go to represent Massachusetts to the government of the Commonwealth of England under Cromwell and so forth. Okay. I think, am I right that we're out of time? Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Don't hesitate to get it if you want more information.
Good.